There are a lot of mysterious and unexplained things that happen in life. Not just with cryptids or the paranormal, but with people and everyday things. In today's video, I decided to do something a little different. I decided to look into some unresolved mysteries. Today's cases are a few cases of missing people, but they all went missing with unexplained causes. Now, a couple of these might seem like typical abductions, but a few of these I thought were weird enough to share. This video might be a little short, but in the future I want to make these longer and have them better edited. But this is me tipping my toes in the water for the first time, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into these unsolved mysteries. Thomas Kelly Brown was a senior in high school at Canadian High School at the time of his disappearance. Canadian is a small Texas town, where he was born and grew up. He sounded like a very well-rounded student. From what I read, he played football in a state championship and thrived on the team before he decided to explore other extracurricular activities. He was very active in the drama community and also a president of his student body. On the evening of November 23, 2016, Tom went out driving around with his friends, and they state he was in a good mood at the time, and nothing was out of the ordinary. At 11:30, Tom's friends dropped him off in the parking lot of Canadian High School football field, where his red Dodge Durango was parked. They made plans for the following day. At approximately 11:46, Thomas is seen on surveillance at Frank's Oil and Gas filling up his truck. This is the last sighting of him. He was due back at home at 12 a.m. for curfew. It is mentioned he was rarely ever late. Around the time he was supposed to be back home, Thomas's brother sent him a text which went unanswered, but investigators believe it was never read. The last ping from a cellular device was close to the parking lot in which he was dropped off. Considerably worried, Thomas's mother also texted him, but it was too not read and not responded to. She eventually placed several calls on his cell phone, which they went directly to voicemail, which makes me believe his cell phone was then turned off. It was very unlike Thomas to not respond to text messages or calls. At around 1:30 a.m. on the morning of November 24th, his mother contacted the police. A search began at 2 a.m. and two more units were dispatched to help in the search. Along with Thomas's family and friends, it is stated that there were two more sightings of a red Dodge Durango. However, they could not confirm whether these were sightings of Thomas or his vehicle due to the angles of the camera. At 8:45 a.m., a helicopter found Thomas's Durango located under some trees near a wastewater treatment plant. There were no sign of Thomas, however, his keys, wallet, and cellular phone were missing. There was also a small amount of fresh blood located on the driver's side door. Surveillance of the area shows that someone dropped Thomas's vehicle off at that spot approximately at 6:05 a.m., but the identity of this person still remains a mystery. Tracker dogs were eventually brought to an area and could track Thomas for about 3/4 of a mile east to southwest before they lost track of his scent. In January of this year, Thomas's backpack was found in a wooded area approximately 4 miles from where his vehicle was discovered. The backpack itself was extremely wet and dirty, given the impression it had been left there for some time. Inside were school books and Thomas's laptop. Investigators stated that there was nothing suspicious on his laptop and it was mostly school-related content. So, since his disappearance, Thomas has not accessed his bank accounts, social media, nor has he reached out to any of his family, friends, or his girlfriend. What happened to Thomas? "30-year-old Tara Greenstead of Osceola, Georgia was last seen on October 22nd of 2005 at an acquaintance's residence around 11 p.m. She apparently was at this residence to help with upcoming pageant operations. Evidence shows that she returned home that night. She was missed the next day by friends at church and was reported missing on October 24th when she failed to report to Irwin County High School, where she taught 11th grade history. Her house was locked when authorities arrived to investigate. Her unlocked Mitsubishi 3000 was in the driveway. $100 was found inside. Clay was on the tires. Family and friends indicated that it might have been unusual for her to leave her car unlocked and drive on a road that was dirt. The car seats were pushed back to accommodate people taller than Grinstead. A latex glove was in the yard. A business card was wedged in the door. Her clothes from the night that she went missing were found in her room, as well as her cell phone. Her nightstand alarm was broken on the floor, and beads were found on the floor as well. One of her bedposts was damaged and the lampshade was askew. The only items that appeared to be missing were her purse, keys, earrings, and everything that she wore that night seemed to have just disappeared. Other than the aforementioned things, there were no other signs of struggle or forced entry. 3 men came on the radar quickly. Grinstead and her boyfriend of 6 years had broken up a few weeks prior. The relationship was described as troubled, but with no intentions or indications of violence. The ex maintained his innocence in this case. A former student had been arrested for harassing Grinstead, but proclaimed his innocence as well. Remember the business card stuck in her door? It belonged to a married police officer from a nearby town. This officer had visited Grinstead many times. He stated that he attempted to visit her Sunday night, but that she wasn't home. He left her 24 phone messages and was with her that weekend. He also maintains his innocence. All 3 men had decent alibis, but none of them covered the entirety of the 34 hours Grinstead was missing. Remember the latex glove? DNA found in the glove was compared to all 3 of the aforementioned men. All came back without a match. As of 2011, documentarian Payne Lindsay began producing a podcast called Up and Vanished, reviewing the evidence on the Grinstead case and investigating it further. The series features interviews with members of the community, friends of the Grinsteads, and former investigators. On February 23, 2017, after a lengthy investigation, it was announced by Georgia Bureau of Investigation that they had received a tip that led to the arrest of Ryan Alexander Duke for murder. About 3 years before Grinstead's disappearance, Ryan Duke had attended the same high school where Grinstead taught. According to Warren Shreed in the court, Duke burglarized Grinstead's home, and when he was discovered, he strangled her and removed her body from the house. Another arrest on March 3, 2017, was made public in connection with Tara's disappearance. Bo Dukes, a former classmate of Ryan Alexander Duke with no familial relation, was charged with attempting to conceal a death, hindering apprehension and tampering with evidence. It is believed Grinstead was transported to Ben Hill County, Georgia Pecan Farm and disposed of. Ben Hill County is north of Osceola and Irwin County. In August 2017, a grand jury filed for new charges against Bo Dukes. 2 counts of making false statements and 1 count of hindering apprehension of a criminal, and 1 count of concealing the death of another. These additional charges are based on Wilcox County indictment stating that Bo Dukes lied to a GBI official who investigated and questioned him in 2016 concerning the disappearance of Grinstead. As of September 7, 2017, no trial date has been scheduled for either Dukes or Duke. Edward Brian McCleary, 16 at the time, from Pensacola, Florida, went skydiving with friends on March 24th in 1962, just before nightfall. He was found unconscious on a beach and alone the following morning. A day or 2 later, there were newspaper clippings about the 4 missing divers, along with their names and ages. In the newspaper article, McCleary states that their dinghy was swept away by strong currents. They tried to moor to a buoy, but missed. He said that they started to develop cramps, with Edward managing to swim 2 miles back to shore. A few days later, the dinghy washed ashore. Shoes and flippers were inside. 2 years later, the same Edward McCleary wrote to Fate magazine detailing what they were stranded on a buoy before, and suddenly there was a thick, eerie fog and also a storm. Out of this fog came a strange, high-pitched whining noise along with the stench of rotting fish. And shortly after, the form of a sea dragon appeared, and this dragon bore plesiosaur picked off McCleary's friends one by one. He goes into so much detail as to describe the shape of the dragon's irises, smooth skin texture, skin color, and shape of its head, and also the length of each of his friends' agonizing screams. The story itself was a couple pages long and read much more like a horror movie. Oddly, the dragon story involves the detail that all 5 of them were put on their flippers before jumping off into the buoy. Somehow, he was able to escape the dragon that was pursuing him. Only one body washed ashore. The others were never found despite a search by the Coast Guard and Navy. The body who washed up was Bradford J. Rice, age 14. When I was a child, I grew up with stories of this man called Mr. Cruel, who abducted children in the area I grew up. My mother and I used to go out for dinner at this Chinese restaurant in Eltham, Melbourne, Australia, called Ying's. The owner, Phyllis Chan's daughter, was murdered a decade before in the area that the killer was never caught. When I was growing up, this story stayed with me for a long time. Phyllis was such a lovely woman who showed her family kindness, and my family as well. Every time we dined at that Chinese restaurant, she was always a pleasure. Now I am 25 years old and still, Mr. Cruel has never been found. Here are some details about his crimes. On the 22nd of August 1987, a man broke into a home in the Lower Plenty armed with a knife and a gun. He tied the hands of the parents and locked them into the cupboard and tied the son to the bed. He cut the phone lines and the 11-year-old daughter was assaulted. On the 27th of December, 1988 in Ringwood, he broke into the back door of a house at 5:30 a.m. armed with a knife and a small handgun. He bound and gagged the parents and demanded money. He grabbed the 10-year-old daughter, Sharon Wills, put tape over her eyes, a ball gag in her mouth, and abducted her. She was released 18 hours later in the grounds of Baywater High School. On the 3rd of July 1990 in Canterbury, he broke into a house at 11:30 p.m. and tied and gagged a 13-year-old girl, Nicola Linus. He placed tape over her eyes, disabled her phones, and searched for money. He drove her to another house and molested her for 50 hours before releasing her at the Power of substation in the suburb of Kew. On the 13th of April 1991 in Templestowe, armed with a knife, he abducted a 13-year-old, Carmen Chan. Her body, with 3 gunshot wounds to the head, was found a year later. It has been reported that a few detectives had doubts whether the crime was by Mr. Cruel. Detective Chris O'Connor answered a journalist's question in 2013 whether Mr. Cruel was responsible. This is what the quote was. "We just don't know if it was Mr. Cruel who murdered Carmen. She just can't be sure because there isn't enough evidence making a value judgment about whether it wasn't him or not in this case." After many hours of interviewing victims and consulting police reports, some of the FBI Operation Spectrum detectives produced a profile of Mr. Cruel. This is what we know about our suspect of Mr. Cruel. His habits in the house in which he held some of his victims. He uses the phrase bozo, worrywart, and missy, and had an Australian accent with no definable class or characteristic. Victims described him as aged between 30 and 50, from 173 centimeters to 180 centimeters tall, possibly with a fair to sandy-colored hair and eyebrows, and sometimes sporting a gingery beard. He had a slim to medium build with a small pot belly. The police actually have a list of 7 possible suspects the man might be. But the man who sits on top of the list likely to be Mr. Cruel. His name is Brian Elker. Although it took me a long time to find his name, if you are interested in finding more about him, I saw a video on YouTube a while back of news crews stalking him down and questioning him. He fits the description of Mr. Cruel down to a T and was arrested in the 70s for serial abduction and rape of a young woman. The police are pretty confident that it's him, but they don't have strong enough evidence to convict him. The story makes me so sad, and there are so many photos of Phyllis Chan online crying and begging for her daughter to be returned to her. She really was such a kind lady, and I remember it made me feel so sad how happy she was. Because I knew she had suffered more pain than many people in this quiet place.